Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 490 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. Today on the show, I talk with Daugherty and Rothshank and Trevor Daugherty, co-founders of the Northern Indiana Clay Alliance. The group has over 60 members and organizes a variety of ceramic events, including the Michiana Pottery Tour. In our interview, we talk about the process of founding a nonprofit, ceramics in the Michiana region, and fundraising for new organizations. If you'd like to find out more information, you can go to indianaclay.org. I did want to say that the Michiana Pottery Tour has been a longtime sponsor of this program, so I did want to disclose that up front. If you'd like to find out more information about the tour, you can go to michianapotterytour.com. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. I'm just going to have you guys start by introducing yourselves so that the listener can get a take on your name and your voice. So maybe if you want to start, Trevor.
I'm Trevor Daugherty. I'm co-founder of the Northern Indiana Clay Alliance and a studio potter in Goshen, Indiana.
And I'm Daugherty and Rothshank, also co-founder of Northern Indiana Clay Alliance and also a potter in Goshen, Indiana.
Goshen is a hot spot of pottery.
That's right. At least we're trying to make it that. That's right.
Well, we did an episode a couple years ago. We couldn't figure out when it was, but maybe 5 years ago, where we talked about the tradition of ceramics, specifically in the Mennonite community and the link to Goshen College. So people can listen back to that. But I wanted to just talk and let people know a little bit about Goshen and about Indiana as a whole, because I think a lot of people, Indiana is one of those states where people are like, where is it? Or people would say, I know where that is, but if you have to point at it on a map, I think sometimes they'll get the wrong state. So either of you could tell us a little bit about Indiana and the clay scene in Indiana.
Indiana is a Midwestern state right below Michigan. And even though Chicago is not in Indiana, we can claim some close proximity to Chicago. The clay scene in Indiana is one that I'm still learning about, but at least in the northern part of the state, there has been a pretty healthy studio pottery movement for the last 50 years or so. And some other interesting things in Indiana, IU, Notre Dame, Ball State all have some pretty recognizable MFA programs over the past years, and Indiana is the home of Amoco, which and Brent. So many of us as studio potters know about Amoco glazes and Brent wheels. Also in Indiana, at the southern tip of Indiana is where Brian Harper is professor, and he's the founder of Art Axis. So although Art Axis is an international sort of clay convener, its actual home is in Indiana. So there's a lot going on in clay in Indiana, and as Trevor reminded me, we're also a state that's rich in natural resources, specifically in timber, which makes it a great place to wood fire. And wood firing has been going on in at least the northern part of the state for quite a while. And there's a great community of makers down in southern Indiana doing wood firing also. So that's I guess a brief overview.
Where are you guys trying to draw from in that bigger region in terms of having the organization be strong and represent the region?
Yeah, and an interesting part about the name Michiana, was put together 100 years ago by one of our congressmen, And to be honest, it doesn't really have much meaning other than we jam two words together. And folks often think of it as Michigan being misspelled. So while it's well known in our area and amongst the ceramic community increasingly, on a national level, it can be really tough to identify where Michiana is. So Northern Indiana specifically, we're trying to put a little bit more of an easy connection there for people nationwide. But I do think we, as Justin alluded to, over the last 50 years, have developed this tradition that's largely born out of both natural resources and kind of the education that happened, post-war with the GI Bills and kind of how money flooded into universities, which is headlined by Notre Dame in our area. But to specifically, answer your question about where we draw the line of Northern Indiana, properly, that's probably the Fort Wayne area. But for us, we're thinking this is for anybody who has a connection to Northern Indiana. So there's a number of potters from around the country who were educated here or born here and still have connection. We can talk a little bit more about our, kind of our membership later on, I assume, but we have a number of people who are consider themselves a part of our Northern Indiana community here, who come back from Michiana Pottery Tour or to Woodfire or do collaborative work, who are located, as far away as Utah and California and Georgia, Kansas. So while we have, certainly a good group here regionally, we consider ourselves to welcome just about anyone who has ties to the area.
Goshen, Indiana, which is where Trevor and I both live, and a number of other potters live. We're only about 20 minutes south of the Michigan, the southern border of Michigan, and we actually have a number of potters who have studios or work connections in the Goshen area, but who live in southern Michigan. And so, as Trevor mentioned, the Michiana moniker doesn't necessarily translate nationally, but we have a number of potters that we connect with on a regular, frequent basis who live in southern Michigan and are connected with cities like Kalamazoo and Grand Rapids and Detroit and those areas. So none of that's geographically very far away from us, and in fact, we're closer to Kalamazoo and Grand Rapids than we are to southern Indiana, which is 5-6 hours away from us.
Can you all talk about the Northern Indiana Clay Alliance itself and how you start a nonprofit? Because I think a lot of people that are listening to this, they know of potters groups. There's different levels of organization with a group. You can have something as casual as, hey, we just have a potluck and we fire the wood kiln, or you can step it up and start a nonprofit like you guys have. So can you talk about how you actually start a nonprofit?
With this one, Trevor did a lot of the heavy lifting, so maybe I'll let him talk about the actual legal aspects of that. But from a more social standpoint, we started with the idea, wanting to formalize an institution to essentially house our Michiana Pottery Tour marketing scheme, and from that we started trying to identify stakeholders who had some sort of lasting investment in an organizational structure, and that became, many of those people became our board of directors. And so with a nonprofit, from a legal standpoint, one of the things you need before you start is a board of directors, essentially the entity that governs the organization. And so pulling together our founding board had to happen before we started that legal process. And so I'll let Trevor comment on that.
Yeah, as Justin alluded to, the Pottery Tour has been around going into our 13th year in 2024, and has grown from a handful of artists who got together, as Justin mentioned, to market their work collectively. Kind of as you head into the holiday season, it's always the last weekend in September. And as it's grown to in 2023, we had 10 studio locations that participated, and almost 55 artists. So that's been a notable jump, and we've seen that both in support of sales and community interest. We of course keep data on sales numbers and the number of visitors that come through the studios, and that has grown consistently every year to surpass over $100,000 in annual sales, and several hundred visitors who come into the region specifically for pots. So as we started to think about, well, where are we going with this? We had a number of institutions contact us wanting to either support us financially or through word of mouth. And when you get into, starting to apply for grants and collecting money, there's a number of guidelines that need to be followed from a legal perspective, just to pull that off. So in terms of creating a 501c3 nonprofit is as simple as going to a lawyer, and they can help you draft bylaws and founding documents. Thankfully, we have a great community here that was able to help us with an art focus as we put those documents together. But I think one of the big challenges for us was what specifically do we want the organization to be about, and how much can we do initially? Because it is a lot of work, especially if you are awarded grants. There's obviously writing the grant themselves, but then collecting data and following up with the granting organizations is a year-long process. And as soon as you get done with that year, you have to start over for the next year. So it's a heavy lift. So that really informed Justin and I's conversations of, well, we want to make sure that we continue to strengthen the Michiana Pottery Tour, but let's also make sure we don't do too much initially, so that the organization can grow and thrive, and there's not burnout amongst our board. Or I currently serve as the executive director of the organization, so that's everything from writing those grants to welcoming members to social media. It's a pretty wide swath of responsibilities at the moment. So that was the other part that really informed our decision. We wanted to make sure, legally we did the right things, but also make sure that we were doing things that we could sustain, because no one likes 1 year of work and then it peters out and we don't have it anymore. So we've been try to really be mindful of what we can do and sustain.
Yeah, that's such a good point, because I think we start strong. We all start strong. And then about 9 months into something, you're like tired and you've got paperwork. And, that's when the energy can really fall off. Trevor, what do you think? Because I noticed in your previous life, you had said that you were a journalist before we got on the mic, but you also have done publishing. I think you're still a part of a magazine that's in the Michiana area. What skills did all of that give you that have helped this transition into being the executive director be easy versus stressful and panic-inducing?
Well, I will certainly say that there's been plenty of panic at times. But as far as what I've brought to the table professionally, I do a lot of communication on a daily basis, so I feel very comfortable on social media or writing emails and communicating with members or potential members. A large part of the work that I've done has been financially driven by people's willingness to support us. So I feel very comfortable asking people for money, just to be honest. That's something that I've done professionally in a lot of different capacities. And as you try to grow a budget for an organization like that, for like ours, that's just the reality. Is you have to be willing to solicit donors. You have to be willing to spread the word and do it effectively. So certainly my background in writing, I think, has served us well to this point.
In terms of fundraising, I think that's also a sticking point for some artist groups is that they can't quantify what they're bringing to the community. Because I think fundraising is often telling the donor, this is what we're bringing to the community, and if you support us, you're helping us in our mission to do this. How do you all think about what this group brings to the community? And then how have you been able to then pitch that to donors to get support for that?
Well, you're catching us at, the end of our first year of existence here. So we are certainly going out and trying to shake the trees for some money at this point. One of the things that's been exciting is we've been awarded grants in our first year, which has really put a lot of wind at our backs. And then as we've gone out and tried to solicit donations, the message that I'm trying to put out there is it's great that we've received grants. However, there's a number of reasons why we can't depend on those grants to come back year after year. And the ones that are, backed by the NEA, seem to be focused more on finding new organizations to support and making sure that the money is spread, around equally. So that was great for us this year. We may not be able to count on that next year. As well as, government funding is just a sticky proposition right now. You just can't count on that money is going to be flowing at the same rate every year. Certainly at both the state and the federal level. I am fond of the sayings that you may not do politics, but politics is always going to do you. And it's like some of these things that are happening in Congress, there's a line item in there for the NEA or for arts funding. And that gets trickled down into, in Indiana, the Indiana Arts Commission is supported by both our federal government and, the Indiana State Senate. It's a charter program that was started by the Indiana State Senate. And eventually somewhere that line item, reaches us. So it's important that we, vocalize that to our politicians, but also be realistic that it was great that we got that money this year. Shouldn't count on it next year. And if we do, then great. If we do get it again, that would be, another feather in our cap. But we need to make sure we're building programming and a budget that's sustainable, as the money ebbs and flows.
One of the folks that I always think that was really good at this, and this sounds totally random, but I promise it will tie in, is Mr. Rogers. I don't know if you guys ever watched his testimony in front of Congress in the late 70s or early 80s, where he is talking about the value of PBS and about the value of his show. And it's like a master class on empathy. Like, how do you get a lawmaker to empathize with what you're doing? And a lot of it, he was talking about imagination and sort of the power of children's thinking and all of that. But I think it brings up the point that, like, if you can get a lawmaker or if it's regionally local, like if it's because sometimes I do think in North Carolina, at least, like a lot of the actual regional arts councils, that's where where you can actually get the money. But you got to be able to write in a way that's empathetic, that makes them want to support you, which is it's a whole skill in and of itself.
One of the messages that seems to resonate really well is that by receiving funding, we're able to essentially do this event free of charge to the community. And while we do have Chicago, a couple hours away, and we have a great museum here in the county, but we don't have a lot of, readily available access to museum quality art that has no cost. And by having this funding, we're able to lower the barrier of entry to see nationally and internationally recognized artists in our community. And that's been a message that has been received very well by, local government and donors and kind of those who we aim to have support from.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Hi, I'm Kara, content creator and Facebook wrangler for Amico Brent, bringing you ideas and support for your creative adventures every day. This week's episode is brought to you by Amico Brent. Find your favorite Amico glaze at your local distributor. Happy glazing!
Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfeld Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online resource for research and inspiration, featuring photos of thousands of objects made by over 800 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great resource for students and teachers. To find out more, visit rosenfeldcollection.com.
Well, I wanted to shift away a little bit from the organization and talk about both of you as artists and how your business is helped by the Michiana Pottery Tour and the Clay Alliance. Can you mentioned that it's about $100,000 in sales, or it's reached that level for the Michiana Pottery Tour, which is a lot. Like that's a significant economic impact for a group of potters. But can each of you talk about how your business is structured relative to the tour? So, for instance, is that money gravy money? Like, is that the money that's the extra cream that rises to the top of your yearly income? Or is that the bread and butter? Like, you need a good tour to have a good business. So can both of you guys address that?
For me, so as a person who helped start the pottery tour 13 years ago, when I moved to Goshen, there were not a lot of other folks working in my field who were my age. There were older people who had established businesses, and there were college age students who were just coming out looking to start, but there weren't early or even mid-career artists. And the folks who did make a living here made their living locally through brick and mortar stores. And when I moved to Goshen, things like Facebook, social media, online web sales, that was all brand new. So we were at the front end of that kind of sales potential. And so I built my business around that model, which benefited me for multiple reasons. One was I don't think I was viewed as competition by anyone locally, because I wasn't targeting local audiences for my sales. And it also meant that I could sell work at varying times of year. And I wasn't tied into specific event-based selling. And so for me, the idea of helping to start a pottery tour was my interest in finding a way to connect to people locally. And for me, it was more about building professional relationships than about sales at the beginning, and understanding that I wanted to have a way to build relationships with other makers and people who are interested in craft, specifically in clay. And so Pottery Tour has served me in that way over the last 13 years. And it's been a way to really invest in the growth and not necessarily have to rely on the income. And so the income from Pottery Tour, I think, as you mentioned, has been gravy over the last couple of years, which is really how it had to be when you start something, on year one or year two. If you're not, if you're thinking about it as has to be a moneymaker, you're bound to be disappointed. And relying on something that has only existed for 1 or 2 years doesn't necessarily translate to me as a smart business decision. And so now that we're 13 years into it, there is some level of expectation that, well, I understand I'm going to make some money at this event. But for me, it's been about the relationship building over the years. And as Trevor mentioned, I think a little earlier, in our region, outside of a local county art museum, there haven't been institutions directed at craft. There's no nonprofit craft center. There's no local art center that people can go to. That just doesn't exist in our town. And so Michiana Pottery Tour, for me, in the beginning, was served in that way, as a way to find other makers to connect with. And I think Northern Indiana Clay Alliance now formalizes that from an institutional perspective, that allows us as a collective group to advocate for ourselves to people who don't understand that we exist in the region. Elkhart County is one of the more populous regions in Indiana, but there's many folks here that we could reach and talk to about craft that don't know we exist. Even after 13 years, we had people at the last pottery tour coming through that said, I had no idea this was even a thing. And for me, it's like, well, we've been here for 13 years. Where have you been? So there's a recognition that that we're still building. And from a business standpoint, I think there's still more to do in that respect.
I'm at a different stage in my career than Justin is. As you mentioned, I mean, I have my hands in some other things professionally, but this has always been kind of the dream for me. I grew up in this area, and my first job I ever had was working for Dick Lehman and Mark Gertzen, and kind of saw what this could be as a life. I mean, obviously, Dick has now, been working for nearly 50 years in clay, and Mark has continued on Dick's tradition in his studio. So my home studio is I purchased from Marvin Bartel uh, almost 5 years ago now, and that's been a big part of my business ramping up, and was honestly kind of a strategy for me, that as to get on Pottery Tour, people knew that there was a stop here, and by being able to continue that, there's a natural connection for the community to me. They've been coming here to Marvin's, home and studio, for a number of years, buying pots on the last weekend of September, and we're able to continue that tradition. So while my practice is smaller, it's been a good way for me to get my name out there and make connections to the local community. Certainly, my bottom line hinges much more on Pottery Tour than maybe some of the other participants do. But like Justin said, I think it's good business practice to make sure that if it rains on Pottery Tour weekend, I can still be here next year. I don't want to be hinging all of my ability to keep the studio open on 2 days. The other thing is that we have a spring open house that my spouse and I, put on in the last weekend of May. So having kind of that same audience familiar with us and where we're located has served us well with the spring open house too. So it's had more than just the benefit of September.
So I wanted to bring food into this conversation, largely because I know, Trevor, that that you've written and you've been a part of a magazine that focuses on food. But potters focus on food. I mean, we are making functional objects to serve food largely. But I think what food can do is that there's a tie to hospitality. There's a tie to kind of the emotion of belonging, being a part of. And as I was researching you, I was reading some of the stuff relative to the magazine, and you guys had written about what it was like to be a neighbor, like just the concept of being a neighbor. And I think this is really important because in the digital world, we can kind of be close to people, but we can't really know what someone else is like because there's the phone or the computer. There's the digital interface. It connects us, but it also separates us. So I like that in this organization, you guys are really focused on like your neighbors, the people in your actual local community. But I wanted to just kind of more philosophically think and talk about, like, what do you think the value of being proactive as a neighbor is now? Like actively reaching out to your community versus, waiting for them to come to you.
Well, post-pandemic, I mean, obviously we've all kind of come out of this period in our history in different ways. For me, it, as Justin alluded to, making those connections with makers in the area that we didn't even know were out there, and they didn't necessarily know that we were out there. We're surpassing 100 members as an organization, and we've had these gatherings that people have come to that we're meeting for the first time. And as you noted, particularly I think with the Instagram ceramic community, it's easy to make some assumptions. Sometimes we're in our studio, working in a vacuum, and we see someone, gets an award or an opportunity, and it can be easy to, feel a certain way about yourself or others when that happens. So that bringing people together has really, I think, started to make some stronger relationships for us, and hopefully will continue to do that. Northern Indiana has this really rich tradition of not only natural resources, which helps with the pottery scene, but also with the food scene. We have one of the largest poultry producers here in Elkhart County in the United States. And we also have a really strong culinary scene, which has to do with both kind of the academic tradition we have in Notre Dame, and kind of the economy that grows there, but also a real recognition that people around here like to know where their food comes from. So we have a really strong culture of farmers markets and co-ops that are member owned. And to me, that has really shown up in the ceramic scene, in that a lot of our chefs in the area are acutely aware of where their food comes from, but they also don't want to be serving it on a white plate made in, overseas, or even made elsewhere in the country. They are increasingly aware that they have this pretty incredible network of makers in our area here, and are leaning on us because they realize that it helps the experience of enjoying food in their restaurant when the plate, is unique, even amongst the table setting that you may be sitting at with your friends or family. It becomes a conversational piece. Like, oh, I didn't, your plate's blue, mine is brown. Look at the texture of this. So that has also increasingly become a part of kind of our community, which is just really neat, and is such a natural connection that I hope we continue to grow, because it does make a lot of sense for both sides.
I would maybe piggyback on some of that neighbor conversation as well, to say that from an institutional standpoint, with both the Clay Alliance and Pottery Tour before that, one of our biggest challenges, both in startup and in continuing to find success, is communication. And there's so much nuance with careers and success and envy and all of those things that we battle as artists, that you can break through when you're sitting face to face with someone. And so we've recognized that our community here, related to Michiana Pottery Tour, that people have made assumptions about us, rightly so. We all do that. And that we have made assumptions about other people, and that we don't know all that's happening in the region. And so reaching out to people specifically through events that connect folks, like Pottery Tour, but like education opportunities in studios or other events, is really what helps us grow together as a network. I think at least I missed the boat on some of that during the pandemic, where we all, focused inward and sold things on Instagram and built our websites and used Zoom calls. But it's really like, in order for the business to grow and be successful, you have to meet people face to face, and advocating for that through this institution, this nonprofit, is our way of formalizing that. And really, really important to build the foundation.
Yeah, we're recording this on election day, and this won't come out till later. But I've been thinking about how political campaigns go door to door, and whether that would work for an art organization where you're literally going door to door to your neighbors and giving them a small gift, like a handmade object of some sort. In our case, clay, but I think this could work for wood or any other arts organization. Because there's something about that, like knocking on someone's door, saying hello, and saying, we have this tour. It's happening once a year, but also we're coming to you in November or whatever month it happens, just to say hello and, we're glad you're here and please come out and see us. That somehow politics, which doesn't seem personal sometimes, they have a very personal way of going to door to door.
Yeah, at my house, I live in a rural area, and while I do have neighbors across the street, many of my neighbors are a 5-10 minute walk. I don't have someone that's, that I can see their porch 20 feet away. And so Pottery Tour is one opportunity for me to meet my neighbors, because it doesn't necessarily happen the rest of the year. And admittedly, I don't always do a great job at connecting, because it's sort of like you said, Ben. It might take me walking over with a coffee mug and introducing myself, and so continuing to work through that is definitely something I'm hopeful for.
Well, to wrap up, I wanted for you guys to plug the upcoming holiday sale. This is it's the tour organization, but it's in December as opposed to when the tour happens. So can you guys talk a little bit about that and then plug the website so people could find out more?
Yeah, so the Holiday Michiana Pottery Tour will be kind of our first iteration of an in-person event during the holiday season. Obviously, we have the event at the end of September. We're really lucky to have a beautiful theater in downtown Goshen that recently went through a $5 million renovation, which is, increasingly rare for those old theaters. And they have a beautiful ballroom upstairs. So it's a natural kind of fit for us to think about how can we expand, sales opportunities for our members, and also continue to expand the pottery tour. So that will be December 1st in downtown Goshen, Indiana, at the Goshen Theater in the ballroom. And we'll have about 25 participating artists, many of whom are on our event in September, but also a number of new faces who have joined our organization. And like we've kind of talked about, this is an opportunity for them to plug in with other artists, but also get their own work out there in front of a more established audience that we've cultivated over the years. So there's information at MichianaPotteryTour.com, and you can learn more about the Northern Indiana Clay Alliance at indianaclay.org.
Well, thank you both. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Thanks, Ben. It's always fun to have a conversation with you.
Thanks, Ben.
I'd like to thank Justin and Trevor for coming on the show. It was a pleasure to chat with them and to hear more about the Northern Indiana Clay Alliance. Before I go, I'd like to thank today's sponsors. That's Amico Brent, the Archie Bray Foundation, and the Rosenfeld Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor on the show, you can get in touch at brickyardnetwork.org. I'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you all for tuning in.
If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.
This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.